In this video presentation, we're going to talk briefly about a couple of topics that are very complicated and very historically rooted. So I'll be making references to elements of Latin American history that we've talked about in the past unit. Um, Also, in this video in particular, I'll be focusing on indigenous peoples in terms of race and the legacy of conquest in Latin America. Of course, the status of African heritage people, the Afro-Latino Americanos, also goes back to that legacy as well. But you get far more detail about that in the Black in Latin America videos that are also part of this unit. So I'll leave the details about that element of race and gender to Dr. Gates in those videos, and just make a couple of references to that as we go along here today. As this slide shows, when I first presented this particular presentation in my face-to-face class, we did this during the week of Columbus Day. So you can see some of the memes and other things that appear on the internet, thinking about recent challenges to Columbus Day. They're very comical. Some of them are a little overly simplistic, but in terms of their actual kind of significance and meaning, maybe not, in terms of how indigenous people have still had to come to reckon with the legacies of Columbus and of European conquest, even to this day. And I'm probably cutting off part of the longer quote from Kurt Vonnegut behind my head here from Breakfast of Champions. So I'll read it to you because it's really good. As children, we were taught to memorize this year, 1492, with pride and joy as the year people began living full and imaginative lives on the continent of North America. Actually, people had been living full and imaginative lives on the continent of North America for hundreds of years before that. 1492 was simply the year sea pirates began to rob, cheat, and kill them. So we know that there's a lot of emotion that is also contained in the telling of history, the thinking about race, class, and gender in our own country, as well as in Latin America. So this is a signpost to where we're going in this presentation, but we need to start off thinking about the concept of race. What is it? What do we mean by that? So take a minute and think about that. How would you define race? For a long time, and I alluded to the notion of scientific racism in the late 19th century in Latin America, for a long time it was considered to be a biological concept, that there was something scientific and biological about racial difference. So scientists of the late 19th century and even early 20th century, including eugenicists, who actually inspired much of the Nazi thinking about race, they used all sorts of tests, including phrenology, meaning measuring people's skulls after they had died and even while they were still alive, to try to determine what that meant about racial difference. And the ultimate goal was always to prove that white European Anglo-Saxon people were at the top of the racial hierarchy, no matter how it was defined. Color was used as a means also of shorthanding racial hierarchies. The white was at the top, then there would be, again, depending on how these things were defined, yellow, brown, and black. Yellow, of course, referring in this time frame I'm talking about to Asian descended people or people of Asian heritage. And I always say it that way because I'm talking about these people in the Americas. So, of course, Asians, Africans, Europeans are not native to the Americas or to Latin America. But it was Europeans who, through conquest, were able to establish their superiority in the racial hierarchy and in the social hierarchy and political hierarchy by connection. So going back to our question, what is race? Although it was thought of as a biological concept in the late 19th century, that thinking would now be considered pseudoscience or pseudoscientific. It's not actually scientific. You don't hear about race in a biology class, for example. Instead, we've come to realize that race is a historically and socially constructed notion. It's a way of defining ourselves against other people, usually using the standard of skin color or other kind of phenotypes or things you can see from the outside. It misses a whole lot, and it creates a myriad of problems, as we know. So we're going to, as I mentioned, think about different indigenous groups living throughout Latin America. There have been 525 years of resistance since the arrival of Columbus in 1492. And then at the end, we'll think about gender and daily life and how gender also factors in. We should think about the notion of intersectionality. Hopefully you've heard of that term or heard that term before. If you haven't, it refers to the overlapping categories that many of us have to inhabit in our lives. So those of us who are people of color and women have those two different categorizations in terms of our race and our gender to think about. Those of us like myself who do benefit from white male privilege have to think about that in terms of the intersectionality of race and gender and how that plays out in our day-to-day lives. This slide and the quotes from Green here, that was a book that I made my class purchase last time around, decided it wasn't worth the purchase, but this quote is good. This was Duncan Green. He wrote a book called Faces of Latin America, which gives a pretty wide-ranging survey of different topics in Latin American studies that I'm trying to give you here without making you buy a book. But thinking about the remarkable ability of indigenous peoples to be resilient. There was a lot of thinking, even among some indigenous peoples, as we read from Guaman Poma in the colonial transculturation document in this unit. Even some indigenous peoples figured that their people, their culture wouldn't exist in the next couple of decades after the conquest. They were trying to figure out what to do about that. Most of the conquerors believed that their ways of religion, their ways of thinking, their ways of dress, their ways of making food, all of these things combined into culture, that would all overcome the indigenous ways of doing things. Or in other words, they would acculturate and force indigenous peoples into the more European way of doing things. And as we talked about, transculturation, that notion is used to explain what actually happened. Indigenous peoples, their cultural markers and traditions influenced the conquerors. So those things went back and forth. Of course, there was a power dynamic involved, but a new culture arose. And in the process, indigenous peoples were also able to maintain and preserve and perfect, in some ways, their own traditions. So, again, this notion that their most remarkable victory or survival, that's where that notion comes from, because it was thought they wouldn't be here. Of course, there were things like the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which Pueblo peoples rose up against the Spanish who had founded the New Mexico colony. One of the main turning points of resistance, or I should say flashpoints of resistance in early colonial history, when an indigenous group completely expelled a group of Spaniards, a group of colonizers from the colony. Of course, the colonists came back, but the terms were quite different. The power dynamic was still there. There was still that air of superiority on the part of the European descended, but the terms were different. Another major flashpoint in terms of indigenous resistance was the rebellion of Tupac Amaru in Peru and Bolivia, what is today Bolivia, in the 1780s. And of course, that one, Tupac Amaru, scholars still debate whether or not he really had Inca ancestry. But whatever the actual case, that was the claim he made in order to play a certain role of resistance against the Spanish colonial empire. And we've talked about, despite the seeming rigidity of the caste system, or the sistema de castas in the Spanish Americas, there was a lot of fluidity in terms of what race people could claim. People could even purchase their whiteness, which would give them different opportunities than they would ever otherwise have. So on this blank slide, or right now it's blank, take a moment and think about how many different indigenous peoples or native peoples we can identify. Go ahead and pause the video and list out as many as you can come up with. They can either be in the United States or throughout Latin America. Hopefully you came up with a few. I mean, we just mentioned the Pueblos. This map, though, this is just Mexico. These maps, if you click on the image, you'll go to an NPR story about a series of maps that were created by Aaron Capella to show the locations of all of the different indigenous groups that inhabited and inhabit the Americas today, where their homelands are, the names that they call themselves. I'm going to highlight right here, the Raramuri or the Tarahumara. Tarahumara was a name that was given to them by the Spaniards. They call themselves the Raramuri. We'll talk a little more about them in a few minutes. And you can read here from the story, and I've referenced Encyclopedia Britannica thinking about the significance of the name for the Comanche people. The significance of renaming other people is part of the story of race and ethnicity for indigenous peoples, especially after the conquest. Spaniards not only renamed entire groups of people or relied on another indigenous group's term for an entire group of people, as in the case of the Comanche, using a Ute word that meant anyone who wants to fight me all the time. There are other ideas about where that name came from, but it wasn't a Comanche word. The Comanche name for themselves is the Numina, like the Navajo name for themselves, the Diné. It essentially means the people, us, those of us who are part of our group, and others are defined by other names because they're not part of our group. So again, this is an exercise of power in which the Spaniards and other European colonizers were able to say, well, no, we think you are this. This even happened at the individual level in terms of the Spanish colonizers baptizing indigenous peoples and giving them new Christian names and not recognizing their indigenous names, their own names for themselves. On this slide, we can see another of Capella's maps, this one here of South America. If you click on the story that I referenced from the last slide, you can get a larger version of it where you can actually see the names that are written there. But again, I think what is striking is how prevalent and how full of people the Americas always, or not always, but long have been, even prior to colonization. And so the place of indigenous people in our societies, their racialization, is something that is kind of both tragic and remarkable in certain ways. I want to talk briefly about the Mapuche people. The Mapuche nation is here in Chile and Argentina, in the Pampas. The Mapuche people, after the conquest of South America, fought long and hard to maintain their own tribal and group identity and to kind of stay away, keep at least at arm's length from the Spanish Empire. They were a semi-nomadic people, and they were not part of the Tawantinsuyu or of the Inca Empire. And so they were able, during the colonial period, to kind of stay away from Spanish control quite a bit. They were outside of the effective range of power that the Spanish Empire had in South America. The Spaniards referred to them as Araucanos, and they thought of them as just hostile people who were always trying to make trouble for us. Of course, that really didn't happen unless the Spaniards were trying to take over their lands or their resources. The Mapuche have been able to preserve their unique cultural identity up into this day. It's been a long and hard fight, especially after the late 19th century efforts of Chile as a nation to consolidate all of its territory, and meaning by that, bring all the people that live in Chile under the control of the Chilean government. The Mapuches fought hard against that. There were efforts to run railroads through their lands, to extract resources from their lands that they constantly challenged. In the early 20th century, there was something called the Desert Campaign, in which the Chilean military violently went after the Mapuches and subjected them, more or less, to their control. But there was still always that element of resistance and challenge. The Mapuche group includes about 1.7 million people total, even today. They speak their own language, and I'm going to try not to butcher the pronunciation, but it's called Mapatungun. There are about 200,000 speakers of that language still, of the 1.7 or so million Mapuche heritage people. Just in kind of very broad strokes in terms of their activities economically and their beliefs, during the 19th and 20th centuries, they had already adopted horses from the Spaniards. They practiced metallurgy, and they were able to trade, during the later colonial period, and then the national period with people of the Spanish Empire and of the Chilean nation. They believe in a four-part creator, so not just a single creator, but an older man and an older woman, with a young man and a young woman, all working together to give life and the earth all of the various aspects of life that people need in order to not only survive, but to maintain the cultural ties that keep the human race going. The machi, or the shaman, is usually a woman, and this is different than even a lot of other indigenous groups, in that women are the ones who are endowed with keeping the connection with the supernatural. For the Mapuche people, some of their oral traditions have been turned to literature, others remain orally transmitted. But the point here to think about the Mapuche is this is a case where a people who had been marginalized and identified in these racial terms as other and outside and hostile have been able to resist and push back. And they have status as an indigenous nation within Chile and Argentina, although they do have to continue to fight for their rights to self-determination. Quite often, there are legal battles that come up over and over again, even within the last decade or so. They continue to fight those. This quote from Mario Juruna, he was the first indigenous deputy in Brazil's parliament, or their Congress. He really puts the case of indigenous peoples right there on the line for us in Latin America. Indians can and want to choose their own road, and this road is not civilization made by whites. That's a legacy, I think, of colonization, something that in our world today we even have a hard time comprehending. We have this system of nation states, and we have these modern ways of doing things. Why don't these other people want to do the same? Instead, many indigenous people see their civilization as more human, as Juruna put it. We do not want paternalistic protection from whites. Indians today want political power. So this is something akin to the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, trying to assert indigenous power, indigenous rights, not only to just kind of be over there on their own and have their own tribal identities, but also to play a role in the nation. And saying, we're here too, we have civilization, we want to participate and we want to contribute, but we don't want to be shouted down. We don't want our views and our ways of doing things just kind of thrown out of hand. I mentioned we would talk about the Tarahumara, or the Raramuri people. They live in the highlands of the Sierra Madres in mostly Chihuahua, but also in Sonora as well, some a little bit further south. The black and white image was taken by a traveler who went through a lot of Mexico in the first decade of the 1900s before the revolution. His name was Karl Lumholtz. And so that's a photograph of the Tarahumara, or the Raramuri people as they were then. The runners, I mean, that's just a couple of years ago that photograph was taken. You may know of the Tarahumara people because, here's a map of the places that they live, again, mostly in Chihuahua, also some up here in the highlands still and over here into Sinaloa and Sonora. But you may know them because they have participated in marathons like the Boston Marathon's photograph of Raramuri runners. They used to run messages to connect to each other throughout their homeland. and it's become kind of part of their identity as a people. They run in their huaraches, or their sandals, and they have amazing endurance for running. As a group of people today, they number between 50 and 70,000. They have roots in the Mogollon culture region that was an ancient culture region in the kind of New Mexico-Chihuahua border area. They had run-ins with Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century, and they were very adept at pushing back against the Jesuits. Many missions were abandoned because the Tarahumaras rose up against them and forced them to leave. But the Jesuits kept coming back. So to this day, they have a kind of folk Catholicism. They've adopted some elements of the Catholic belief system into their ways of doing things, but they continue practices of their own. One of these for them is the use of seguino, or a kind of corn beer that they have brewed for as long as their history can be recounted. And they have seguinadas, which are beer festivals that mostly occur in the winter, when they need to bring groups of neighbors together to kind of regroup and think about the coming year as a people. These are things they still do to mark their cultural identity and their place as a people. Like the Mapuches, they have had to battle intensely, even within just Chihuahua itself, the state government, to have rights as a group of people, to maintain ties to their homelands and their resources. But despite a lot of setbacks, and despite discrimination even being looked down upon, they have been able to maintain those things. Many of you listen to the story El Juez on Radio Ambulante. You can click on this picture of Juan Zapata to get there as well, if you haven't listened to that one yet. The case of Juan Zapata shows the ways that in Guatemala, at least in Mayan Guatemala, indigenous systems of justice continue to coexist with the official state justice system of Guatemala. It creates all sorts of problems, as the story of Juan Zapata shows, but to the people, to the Mayan people, who feel like the justice system, the police, either discriminates against them or ignores them, appealing to a local headman like Zapata, or a local judge, as he's known, El Juez. This is a way that they can have some sort of justice for mostly kind of community level issues. So a computer was stolen, for example, in one of the stories that is recounted in the podcast, and people went to Zapata, the culprit was found, and they were subjected to shikai, which is a kind of public caning or beating, a certain number of lashings to be given, and usually a relative of the person has to give the lashings as this method of meting out a punishment and getting some sort of justice for the person who has been wronged. A lot of people, a lot of us, would see that as kind of barbaric and outmoded. But it also has that other element of helping to preserve Mayan cultural practices and allowing them to practice their own self-determination and autonomy to receive justice as they understand it. This is a photograph of Rigoberta Menchú, who was a Mayan woman herself that wrote a famous account of the violence of the early 80s in Guatemala. She won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to make the genocides known. And she's a good example of that intersectionality that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. She is a woman living in a Mayan community that is also looked down upon because of their indigenous roots. And women also have to kind of try to make a space for themselves within the context of what has become known broadly throughout Latin America as machismo and marianismo. We'll talk about that a little bit. So as we go along for the remainder of this presentation, we'll think about some of the issues that are facing women across Latin America. What is the significance of that intersectionality? Things like agrarian reform, which came to Guatemala during the 10 Years of Spring, during its revolution in that moment where there was a democratic system. sometimes tended to overlook women. That was in large part because the patriarchal system of colonialism and of the West was influencing efforts to try to remake Guatemala. So often, having Guatemala for the Guatemalans didn't necessarily mean understanding what the people themselves wanted, what women would need. And so I say all of that to preface the idea that in many indigenous societies, women owned land, or if they didn't own the land, they owned the implements with which to work the land, the seeds. That was their responsibility. They were the ones who should have been consulted with agrarian reform, and often they were not. Their husbands or their fathers or their brothers were designated as heads of household, and they were the ones who were given that kind of authority. A similar pattern went along with the neoliberal reforms of more recent times that have tried to bring free trade globally, but tried to kind of push people into factory jobs, into labor in that way, wage labor. Women often had to go to work in some of those places. Women are the ones who work in the maquiladoras on the border, for example, by and large, to support their families. They've become these low-wage laborers who continue to have to fulfill all of their seemingly family, or I should say, they're not seemingly, but their maternal responsibilities that have been given to them culturally as women. And this is not unique to women in Latin America. Of course, this is something that women in the United States face, but it is a lot sharper and more pronounced in Latin America because of the legacies of Spanish Catholicism and colonialism and a patriarchal kind of society there. Love this quote. You've only got one mother. Your father could be any son of a bitch. And again, that is to say, the women are the ones who are responsible. That notion of Marianismo comes from the cult of Virgin Mary, as you can read from that slide that I co-opted for my own slides. But women are seen as being responsible, morally and spiritually superior to men. They can endure greater suffering, and unfortunately, they're made to endure greater suffering because of that way of thinking. Machismo is not necessarily the flip side. Maybe it is the flip side of the same coin. I think many of us have a notion of what that means, but it captures manliness in Latin American cultures to show, a man's virility, his role as a provider and a protector, his role as needing to protect the honor and the place of women in his life. So this is a way of thinking that confines men and women to very specific roles. The photograph there, some of you may have recognized, these are the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, who publicly protested the disappearance of their family members during the military dictatorship in the late 70s and early 80s. They, of course, were taking on a role that was outside of what the traditional gender norms are for women in their societies. Also, in the 20th century, there have been movements for LGBTQ rights in Latin America, as there have been in the United States. I love this image I found on the internet. It's a mural that has been painted, this one not in Cuba. I think this one was actually from Venezuela, if I'm remembering correctly. But of course, Che Guevara in drag with the rainbow pride behind him. Guevara himself was pretty homophobic. He was a revolutionary in many rights and fought for the needs of the impoverished, fought for the ability of Latin America to kind of stand on its own two feet against imperialism as he saw it. But he also had these darker sides to him as well. And so it is kind of ironically fitting that this sort of a pro LGBTQ rights image would be created in Latin America. Across Latin America, just trying to think about the gains that gay, lesbian, and other people have been able to make, gay marriage has been legalized. It's been legalized in Mexico now as well, in a lot of places, but there are still a lot of places where it has not been. And in those areas, especially in Central America, the kind of pushback against recognizing the civil rights of LGBTQ people is extremely strong, and it's extremely rooted in that Catholic patriarchy that I was just talking about. Whereas gay people are seen as of the devil, as morally corrupt and problematic. And so there are kind of these cultural cues then that keep gender norms in check in certain ways. Those are also codified legally, which puts limits on the rights of people who happen to be gay, lesbian, or trans in these places. They, of course, have been organizing and working to fight for their rights. They've made progress, as they have in the United States. And again, it's important to think about the intersectionality of these people as well, who may occupy a place as an indigenous person or a place as a person of African heritage in Latin America, who are also gay and trying to navigate the strictures placed upon them by their societies. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'll just make a brief comment or two about African heritage people. I don't have a slide for it in Latin America because I want you to watch the Black in Latin America videos, or at least as much of them as you can. But Africans, of course, came with the earliest conquistadores. Some of them were conquistadores themselves. If you're interested in more about that, Matt Restall's 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, which I've mentioned before, has a really good chapter on that. But they weren't just coming to the Americas as slaves, although most of them did, especially in the 16, 17, 1800s. Others had already been part of the communities in the Iberian Peninsula, had either gained their freedom, had been formerly slaves, or were of Muslim descent and had established themselves in the Iberian Peninsula before at least nominally converting to Christianity in order to keep their homes and their possessions in Spain or Portugal. These were the people that came as conquistadores. Others were brought by the millions to, I'll use the map even though it's not what I'm talking about, to mostly Brazil and Cuba, for thinking about major nations in Latin America, but places where sugar production and then coffee production were intensive. And those were labor-intensive industries that required a lot of hard, back-breaking work. Slaves were made to do that. And so the African heritage sector of the population in both of those nations is very high. As we'll see in the case of Mexico, there's sort of an adage that everyone has a black grandma in their closet, meaning that there was intermixture with African heritage people who many came to Mexico also as slaves, but there wasn't the same kind of economy as intensive there. Many of them gained their freedom, although they were still in a lower status position in their society because of their race. That is a part of Mexico's history, a part of Latin American social history that isn't always dealt with because it's sort of erased by the notion of mestizaje or racial intermixture. But again, as we'll see, there are still a lot of African traditions that have been kind of run through the mill of transculturation as well that manifest in different ways throughout Latin America. Thanks for listening to this, and please let me know what questions you have as we continue with this unit.